When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, the country was on its knees. Unemployment stood at over 6 million people, roughly a quarter of the workforce. The Great Depression had devastated an economy already crippled by the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany's industrial output had collapsed, its currency had experienced catastrophic hyperinflation just a decade earlier, and the nation was drowning in unpayable war reparations. Yet within just 6 years, by 1939, Hitler had built the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. The Wehrmacht boasted over 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and a navy that would soon challenge British naval supremacy. How did a bankrupt nation accomplish what seemed economically impossible? The answer lies in one of history's most audacious financial schemes, a combination of economic sleight of hand, brutal exploitation, and creative accounting that would ultimately prove as unsustainable as it was impressive. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Hjalmar Schacht was not a Nazi ideologue. Born in 1877 to a German family living in New York, he had built his reputation as a financial wizard during the Weimar Republic. In 1923, during Germany's catastrophic hyperinflation, when people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, Schacht engineered the creation of the Rentenmark, a new currency backed by land values that miraculously stabilized the German economy. This achievement made him a household name in Germany and brought him to Hitler's attention. When Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank in March 1933 and later economics minister in August 1934, Schacht became the architect of what would become known as the Nazi economic miracle. But Schacht understood something fundamental that would shape Germany's entire rearmament program. Germany lacked the hard currency, the gold reserves, and the international credit necessary to purchase the raw materials needed for massive military production. Steel required iron ore. Aircraft needed aluminum. Tanks demanded rubber for their treads and high-grade steel for their armor. Germany possessed none of these resources in sufficient quantities, and the country's ability to import them was severely constrained by the Treaty of Versailles and the nation's empty treasury. Schacht's solution was ingenious, deceptive, and ultimately catastrophic. In 1934, he created a dummy corporation called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Metallurgical Research Corporation, which everyone simply called Mefo. This company existed only on paper, backed by 4 major German industrial firms, including Krupp and Siemens, but its real purpose was to serve as a vehicle for massive government deficit spending, disguised as private industrial bills of exchange. Here's how the scheme worked. German armaments manufacturers needed money to expand their factories and begin producing weapons. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden from rearming, so these transactions had to be hidden. Instead of the government openly funding military production, which would have raised alarms internationally and shown up in official budgets, manufacturers would present their bills to Mefo. Mefo would accept these bills and guarantee payment, essentially creating a form of currency called Mefo bills. These bills could be traded between companies, deposited at banks, or ultimately presented to the Reichsbank for redemption in actual Reichsmarks. The beauty of the system was its opacity. Mefo bills didn't appear in government budgets as military spending, they looked like ordinary commercial transactions between private companies. Banks loved them because they paid higher interest rates than government bonds and appeared to be backed by solid industrial firms. Companies loved them because they provided immediate liquidity for expansion, and Hitler loved them because they allowed him to begin rearming Germany in secret while maintaining the fiction that he was abiding by Versailles Treaty restrictions. Between 1934 and 1936, Mefo bills financed approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of military production. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire national budget in 1933 had been less than 7 billion Reichsmarks. Schacht had essentially created money out of thin air, backed by nothing but the promise of future government redemption. The scheme worked brilliantly as long as confidence remained high and the bills kept circulating, but Schacht knew it was a time bomb. The bills had maturity dates typically 5 years from issuance. Eventually, they would have to be redeemed for actual money, and that money didn't exist. The only way to prevent economic collapse would be either to repudiate the debt, which would destroy Germany's financial system, or to acquire new sources of wealth to pay off the obligations. This fundamental problem would drive much of Nazi Germany's aggressive expansion in the late 1930s. They needed to conquer new territories not just for ideological reasons, but because their entire economic system was built on a foundation of debt that could only be serviced through plunder. Hermann Goring entered the economic picture in 1936 when Hitler appointed him to lead the four-year plan, a massive program designed to make Germany self-sufficient in key strategic materials within 4 years. Goring, better known as the corpulent, medal-bedecked head of the Luftwaffe, was an unlikely choice for such a critical economic role. He had no training in economics, no experience in industrial management, and a reputation for incompetence in matters requiring sustained attention and careful planning. But Hitler didn't choose Goring for his economic expertise. He chose him for his absolute loyalty and his willingness to push the German economy to its breaking point in pursuit of military readiness. The four-year plan represented a fundamental shift in Nazi economic policy, moving from Schacht's relatively cautious financial manipulation toward total war preparation, regardless of economic consequences. The plan's central goal was autarky, complete economic self-sufficiency that would make Germany immune to blockade and able to wage war without depending on imports. This was easier proclaimed than achieved. Germany lacked many essential raw materials. The country had no natural rubber, insufficient petroleum, inadequate supplies of high-grade iron ore, and limited reserves of copper, tin, and other strategic metals. Göring's solution was to force German industry to develop synthetic substitutes and to exploit every possible domestic resource, no matter how inefficient or expensive. Under the four-year plan, massive investments flowed into synthetic fuel production from coal, synthetic rubber from chemical processes, and low-grade iron ore mining from German deposits that would normally be considered uneconomical. The famous IG Farben chemical conglomerate expanded its production of Buna, synthetic rubber made from coal and petroleum byproducts. New facilities sprouted across Germany to convert coal into gasoline using the Fischer-Tropsch process, producing aviation fuel at costs far higher than imported petroleum, but achieving the goal of domestic production. Aluminum production ramped up dramatically, fed by hydroelectric power from German rivers and increasingly by power generated from German coal. Göring approached these projects with characteristic bombast and disregard for cost. When engineers protested that synthetic fuel cost 3 times more than imported oil, Göring reportedly thundered that cost was irrelevant when Germany's military future was at stake. When industrialists warned that forcing development of low-grade German iron ore would require enormous capital investment for minimal returns, Göring ordered the construction of the massive Hermann Göring Werke, state-owned industrial facilities designed to exploit these inferior resources. The economics were insane by any normal standard, but the four-year plan operated under different rules. Efficiency didn't matter, profitability didn't matter. All that mattered was reducing Germany's dependence on imports and creating the industrial capacity to wage war. By 1939, Germany had achieved remarkable progress toward autarky in some areas. Synthetic fuel production had increased from virtually zero to nearly 2 million tons annually. Synthetic rubber production had begun on a significant scale. Aluminum production had tripled. But these achievements came at enormous cost. The investments required diverted resources from other sectors of the economy. Living standards stagnated as consumption was suppressed in favor of heavy industry. Agricultural production declined as labor and resources flowed to military-related industries. And despite all the effort and expense, Germany remained far from genuine self-sufficiency in critical materials. When war came in 1939, Germany still imported most of its oil, much of its iron ore, and critical supplies of rubber, copper, and other strategic materials. The human cost of Nazi economic policy became starkest in the systematic plunder of Jewish wealth and property. This wasn't just about hatred and persecution, though those were central to Nazi ideology. It was also about financing rearmament through theft on a massive scale. When Hitler came to power, Germany's Jewish population numbered about 525,000 people, less than 1% of the total population. But German Jews were disproportionately represented in professional classes, business ownership, and wealth. They owned department stores, banks, factories, and valuable real estate. Conservative estimates place the total value of Jewish-owned property in Germany in 1933 at over 10 billion Reichsmarks, roughly 1.5 times the annual national budget. The expropriation began gradually, disguised as legal restrictions and economic pressure rather than outright confiscation. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 excluded Jews from many professions and public positions. Subsequent regulations barred Jews from owning businesses in certain sectors, forced the sale of Jewish-owned farms, and imposed special taxes on Jewish property. Each restriction was presented as a matter of racial policy, but each also served to transfer wealth from Jewish hands to the Nazi state and its supporters. The process accelerated dramatically after Kristallnacht in November 1938, the coordinated nationwide pogrom that destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses and synagogues. And in the aftermath, the Nazi government imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, ostensibly as compensation for the damage caused during the pogrom, damage that had actually been inflicted by Nazi stormtroopers and their sympathizers. This billion Reichsmark fine, equivalent to roughly 15% of the total estimated Jewish wealth in Germany, flowed directly into government coffers and helped fund military expansion. But the fine was only part of the theft. Following Kristallnacht, new regulations forced the Aryanization of remaining Jewish businesses. Jewish owners were compelled to sell their enterprises at fire sale prices to non-Jewish Germans, often Nazi party members or well-connected industrialists. The state took a cut of every transaction through special fees and taxes. Jews attempting to emigrate faced a Reich flight tax that could consume up to 90% of their remaining assets, and they were prohibited from taking jewelry, art, or other valuable portable property out of the country. These confiscated valuables went into German state reserves, converted into hard currency through international sales, or simply appropriated by Nazi officials for their personal benefit. The gold from jewelry alone represented millions of Reichsmarks in value. Artworks seized from Jewish collectors found their way into German museums or the private collections of Nazi leaders, particularly Goring, who amassed one of Europe's largest private art collections, largely through theft from Jewish owners. By 1939, the systematic plunder of Jewish wealth had transferred billions of Reichsmarks worth of property, businesses, real estate, and liquid assets to the German state and its supporters. This represented a significant, though often overlooked, source of funding for rearmament. It provided hard currency when foreign exchange was desperately scarce. It enriched Nazi officials and party members, ensuring their loyalty. And it demonstrated to the world that Nazi Germany would stop at nothing in pursuit of its goals. The economic exploitation of German Jews was merely a preview of what would come, when Germany conquered other nations and gained access to the wealth of entire countries. Schacht's Mefo bills solved one problem but created another. They generated the internal financing needed to expand arms production, but they didn't address Germany's critical shortage of foreign exchange and imported raw materials. No amount of creative domestic financing could create the Swedish iron ore, Romanian oil, Spanish tungsten, and dozens of other imported materials essential for modern weapons production. Germany's gold reserves were exhausted, its credit abroad was limited by suspicion of Nazi intentions, and ordinary international trade was constrained by the country's inability to pay for imports with exports. Schacht's solution to this problem was as clever as the Mefo bills, though ultimately just as unsustainable. He negotiated a series of bilateral trade agreements with countries in Eastern and Southern Europe and Latin America, agreements that bypassed normal currency, exchanges and established barter arrangements that favoured German interests. The key mechanism was the clearing agreement. Under these arrangements, Germany would purchase raw materials from a trading partner, say Romania or Yugoslavia, but payment wouldn't be made in gold or freely convertible currency. Instead, the payment would be credited to a clearing account maintained in Berlin. The exporting country could then use these credits only to purchase German manufactured goods. This system gave Germany enormous advantages. First, it allowed Germany to acquire essential raw materials without depleting its scarce hard currency reserves. Second, it locked trading partners into continued commerce with Germany since they could only realize value from their exports by buying German products. Third, it allowed Germany to manipulate the terms of trade, often overvaluing German manufactured goods and undervaluing imported raw materials. Countries that entered these clearing agreements often found themselves trapped. Romania discovered that its oil sales to Germany generated clearing credits that could only be spent on German industrial equipment, chemicals, and manufactured goods, often at inflated prices. Yugoslavia found that its copper and bauxite exports earned credits usable only for German products, creating a form of economic dependency. Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece all entered similar arrangements, gradually becoming economic satellites of Nazi Germany even before military conquest made them political satellites. The system worked particularly well in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, regions that had traditionally exported agricultural products and raw materials to Western Europe, but found those markets restricted by protectionist policies during the Great Depression. Germany offered a seemingly attractive alternative, a large market for their exports with guaranteed purchases. What these countries often failed to realize until too late was that they were exchanging genuine commodities for clearing credits of dubious long-term value. By 1939, Germany had established clearing agreements with countries throughout Europe and Latin America. These agreements provided the bulk of Germany's imported raw materials without requiring payment in gold or hard currency, but they also created another form of debt. The clearing accounts accumulated enormous German obligations that would eventually need to be settled. By 1939, Germany owed its trading partners billions of Reichsmarks in clearing debts, obligations that could realistically only be liquidated through conquest and plunder of the creditor nations. The irony was bitter. Countries like Yugoslavia and Romania had accepted German promises of payment, only to find that Germany's ultimate settlement plan involved military occupation and outright seizure of their resources. Fritz Todt was a civil engineer who became one of the most important figures in Nazi Germany's economic mobilization, though he is often overlooked in favor of more famous figures like Speer or Goring. Born in 1891, Todt joined the Nazi Party in 1922 and quickly established himself as an expert in large-scale construction projects. In 1933, Hitler appointed him General Inspector of German Roadways, a position that gave him responsibility for one of the Third Reich's most visible achievements and most important economic programs, the construction of the Autobahn network. The Autobahn project served multiple purposes in Nazi economic planning. Most obviously, it provided employment for hundreds of thousands of workers at a time when unemployment remained stubbornly high despite Nazi propaganda claims of full employment. The massive construction project absorbed labour, generated demand for cement, steel and construction equipment, and created the appearance of economic dynamism that bolstered public support for the regime. But the Autobahn wasn't primarily about civilian transportation or even about employment. It was about military preparation. The wide, straight highways were designed from the beginning to facilitate rapid movement of troops and military equipment across Germany. The routes were planned to connect industrial centres, military bases, and likely invasion routes. Bridge capacities were specified to handle heavy tanks. Road widths and curves were calculated to accommodate military convoys. The Autobahn was a weapons system masquerading as a public works project. Todt's organisation, which eventually grew to employ over 1 million workers, pioneered the use of forced labour on a massive scale. Initially, the workforce consisted largely of unemployed volunteers and workers assigned through government labour programmes. But as rearmament accelerated and labour became scarce, Todt increasingly relied on compulsory labour service, prisoners, and later foreign workers and concentration camp inmates. This marked another crucial element of Nazi economic strategy, the systematics. Exploitation of unfree labour to achieve production goals impossible through normal market mechanisms. The efficiency gains were enormous from the Nazi perspective. Forced labourers could be paid subsistence wages or nothing at all. They could be worked for longer hours in worse conditions than free workers. They required minimal investment in housing, food, or safety equipment, and they were infinitely replaceable. If workers died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or industrial accidents, new workers could be conscripted from the growing pool of political prisoners, racial undesirables, and occupied populations. Todt's success with the Autobahn led to his appointment as head of Organisation Todt, a massive construction and engineering entity that would eventually employ millions of workers on projects across occupied Europe. In 1940, Hitler appointed him Minister of Armaments and Munitions, giving him authority over much of Germany's war production. Todt brought to this role the same ruthless efficiency he had demonstrated in construction. He streamlined production processes, eliminated redundancies, and pushed for standardization of military equipment. But he also recognized, earlier than most Nazi leaders, that Germany's war economy was fundamentally unsustainable. In early 1942, just before his death in a plane crash, Todt reportedly told Hitler that the war could not be won economically and should be ended through negotiation. Hitler predictably ignored this advice, and Todt's position went to Albert Speer, who would prove more willing to push the economy to absolute collapse in pursuit of total war. But Todt's legacy lived on in the organization bearing his name and in the model of forced labor exploitation that would reach its horrific culmination in the systematic working to death of millions of concentration camp inmates and enslaved foreign workers. The Reichswerke Hermann Goring, established in 1937, represented the apotheosis of Nazi state capitalism and illustrated how far the regime was willing to distort normal economic principles in pursuit of autarky and rearmament. The company was created specifically to exploit low-grade German iron ore deposits that private industry had deemed uneconomical. The name itself was typical Nazi propaganda, associating a major industrial initiative with Goring personally, but the enterprise was entirely state-owned and operated for strategic rather than profit-oriented goals. Germany's problem with iron ore was both simple and severe. Modern steel production required high-grade ore, preferably with iron content above 60%. Germany's Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland, had some iron ore deposits, but most were low-grade, with iron content often below 35%. Processing such ore required significantly more energy and generated far more waste than processing high-grade Swedish ore, which Germany had traditionally imported. Private steel companies calculated that exploiting German low-grade ore would cost roughly 50% more than importing Swedish ore, making it economically irrational under normal market conditions. But Goring and Hitler didn't care about market conditions. They cared about making Germany independent of iron ore imports, particularly from Sweden, a neutral country that couldn't be relied upon in wartime. Over the objections of private industry leaders like the Krupp dynasty, who saw the project as wasteful government competition with private enterprise, Goring ordered the establishment of the Reichswerke to mine and process German iron ore, regardless of cost. The Reichswerke grew with breathtaking speed, fueled by unlimited access to state financing and the power to commandeer resources, labor, and facilities. By 1939, it had become one of Europe's largest industrial conglomerates, encompassing not just iron ore mining and steel production, but also coal mines, shipping companies, machinery manufacturers, and arms production facilities. The company employed over 600,000 workers directly and controlled assets worth billions of Reichsmarks. Its production capacity rivaled that of the entire private German steel industry, though at costs that would have bankrupted any profit-oriented corporation. The economics of the Reichswerke illustrated the fundamental irrationality of the Nazi war economy. The company operated at a substantial loss, subsidized by state funds that ultimately came from deficit spending and debt creation. It produced steel at costs roughly 30 to 40% higher than private competitors who used imported ore. It tied up enormous amounts of capital in facilities that made economic sense only under the assumption of total war and complete blockade. Yet, from the Nazi strategic perspective, the Reichswerke was a success. It increased domestic steel production capacity, reduced dependence on imports, and demonstrated the regime's power to override market forces in pursuit of strategic goals. When war came and British naval power did indeed cut off Swedish iron ore shipments for periods, the Reichswerke's existence proved its worth to Nazi planners, even if the costs remained astronomical. The company also pioneered another troubling aspect of Nazi economics, the integration of concentration camp labor into industrial production. Reichswerke facilities were among the first to systematically employ concentration camp inmates as forced laborers, a practice that would expand horrifically as the war progressed. This fusion of state-owned heavy industry with the concentration camp system created a business model based on literal slavery, where workers were leased from the SS at minimal cost and worked until they died, to be replaced by new prisoners from the ever-growing camp system. The Reichsbank under Schacht's leadership had enabled much of the early rearmament through the Mefo bill scheme, but by 1937 even Schacht recognized that the system was reaching its limits. The bills were coming due, requiring redemption in actual currency. Government debt had skyrocketed. Inflation threatened as too much money chased too few consumer goods, since production had been redirected toward military equipment. Schacht began to advocate for slowing rearmament, consolidating economic gains, and allowing the economy to stabilize before pushing further. Hitler would have none of it. In November 1937, at a secret meeting later documented as the Hossbach Memorandum, Hitler outlined his plans for aggressive expansion, making clear that war was inevitable and rearmament must accelerate regardless of economic consequences. Schacht found himself increasingly sidelined, his warnings ignored, his authority undermined. In November 1937, Goring effectively took control of economic policy through the four-year Plan Office, reducing Schacht to a figurehead. In January 1939, Schacht resigned as Reichsbank president, and by the time war broke out in September 1939, he had been removed from all positions of economic authority. Schacht's departure marked a crucial transition. The banker who had enabled Nazi rearmament through clever financial engineering was replaced by crude, direct exploitation of conquered territories and enslaved populations. The sophisticated economic management that had characterized the early Nazi years gave way to simple plunder. This shift would become apparent as Germany began its conquests, starting with Austria in 1938 and Czechoslovakia in 1939. Where systematic looting of gold reserves, industrial equipment, and raw materials previewed the wholesale plunder that would characterize German occupation policies throughout World War II. The Dresdner Bank, one of Germany's largest financial institutions, played a central role in financing Nazi economic crimes while maintaining the appearance of legitimate banking operations. Under the leadership of Karl Rasch, who would later be tried and convicted at Nuremberg, Dresdner Bank provided crucial financial services for the SS, managed accounts filled with property confiscated from murdered Jews, and financed the expansion of German industrial operations into occupied territories. The bank's involvement in economic crimes began early in the Nazi period. When Jewish-owned businesses were forced to sell during Aryanization, Dresdner Bank frequently arranged the transactions, earning fees from both forced sellers and Nazi buyers, while ensuring that purchase prices were far below market value. The bank also provided loans to Nazi party members and German corporations purchasing these confiscated businesses, profiting from both sides of transactions built on theft and persecution. As the war progressed and systematic murder of European Jews intensified, Dresdner Bank managed what became known as the Melmer account, named after SS Captain Bruno Melmer, who supervised deposits. This account received gold, jewelry, currency, and other valuables taken from victims at death camps. Bank employees processed these deposits, converted stolen property into Reichsmarks, and transferred funds to SS accounts, all while maintaining meticulous records that would later provide damning evidence of the bank's complicity. The amounts flowing through the Melmer account were staggering. Between August 1942 and the end of the war, the account processed deposits worth approximately 75 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's currency. This represented the melted gold from dental fillings, the converted value of jewelry taken from deportees, and the cash found in victims' belongings. Bank officials knew exactly what they were handling. The deposits included gold teeth, clearly identifiable as having come from corpses rather than legitimate sources, yet the bank processed them without question, taking its customary fees and maintaining normal business procedures for what was clearly stolen property from murder victims. The economic relationship between Nazi Germany and neutral countries, particularly Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal, represented another crucial dimension of how Hitler funded his military machine. These countries maintained official neutrality throughout the war, but engaged in extensive trade with Germany that provided essential materials and financial services. Switzerland's role was particularly important and controversial. Swiss banks accepted deposits of gold and currency from Nazi Germany throughout the war, providing a mechanism for Germany to convert plundered assets into internationally accepted currency. Some of this gold came from national banks of occupied countries stolen immediately upon German occupation. Some came from Jewish victims, melted down dental gold and jewellery converted into standard gold bars and deposited in Swiss accounts. Swiss authorities claimed they couldn't distinguish looted gold from legitimate reserves, though evidence suggests they knew or should have known the origin of much of what they accepted. Switzerland also provided a marketplace for German industry to purchase materials not available through normal trade channels. Through Swiss intermediaries, Germany obtained tungsten from Spain and Portugal, essential for hardening steel in armor-piercing ammunition. German corporations used Swiss banks to conduct international transactions that would have been impossible through direct trade. Switzerland's military industries sold precision instruments, weapons components, and other military equipment to Germany throughout the war, while simultaneously selling to Allied powers, profiting from both sides while claiming neutrality. Sweden's relationship with Germany combined economic dependence and pragmatic accommodation. Sweden possessed high-grade iron ore deposits in the far north, particularly around Kiruna and Gällivare, that were essential for German steel production. Throughout the war, Sweden continued selling iron ore to Germany, with millions of tons shipped annually through the Norwegian port of Narvik or through the Baltic when ice conditions permitted. Swedish leaders justified this trade as necessary for Swedish security, arguing that refusing to sell to Germany would invite German invasion. There was truth to this concern. Germany did invade Norway partly to secure the iron ore shipping routes, but the continuation of ore sales throughout the war provided Germany with resources essential for weapons production. Sweden also provided other valuable services to Germany. Swedish ball bearing manufacturer SKF sold precision bearings essential for aircraft engines and other military equipment to Germany throughout the war. Swedish companies purchased German goods, providing Germany with foreign exchange. Swedish banks facilitated financial transactions for German corporations. While Sweden maintained formal neutrality and did assist Allied intelligence operations and accept refugees, Swedish economic cooperation with Germany was substantial and economically significant for the German war effort. Spain and Portugal, ruled by authoritarian regimes sympathetic to fascism, though not formally allied with Germany, provided crucial materials that Germany could not obtain elsewhere. Spain's tungsten mines in Galicia became a critical source for this strategic material, essential for armor-piercing ammunition and high-temperature applications. Germany competed with Britain and the United States to purchase Spanish tungsten, driving prices to extraordinary heights and enriching Spanish mine owners while providing Franco's regime with badly needed foreign exchange. Portuguese tungsten from mines in the Serra da Estrela region similarly became the target of economic warfare, with Germany and the Allies bidding against each other for supplies. Portugal also served as a marketplace for industrial diamonds, critical for precision tool manufacturing, that Germany obtained through Portuguese intermediaries. The neutral country's economic relationships with Nazi Germany raised profound moral questions. From a purely legal standpoint, neutral nations had the right to trade with belligerents on both sides, and international law recognized their position. But moral accountability extends beyond legal obligations. By accepting looted gold, neutral banks became fences for stolen property. By selling strategic materials, neutral countries extended Germany's ability to wage aggressive warfare. By providing financial services, neutral institutions enabled economic crimes on a massive scale. After the war, these countries faced varying degrees of pressure to account for their wartime economic relationships with Germany. Switzerland eventually agreed to return some looted gold and to compensate some victims of Nazi theft, though critics argued the settlements were inadequate. Sweden acknowledged the moral problems with wartime trade policies, but provided limited compensation. Spain and Portugal, both of which continued under authoritarian rule for decades after the war, faced less international pressure and provided minimal accounting for their economic collaboration with Nazi Germany. The profits made by individuals and institutions in neutral countries from facilitating Nazi economic crimes were substantial and in most cases never recovered or redistributed to victims. The economics of specific military campaigns reveal how conquest was designed to be self-financing through immediate plunder and long-term exploitation. The invasion of the Soviet Union provides the clearest example of this planning. German economic authorities developed detailed plans for exploiting Soviet resources before the invasion even began. The infamous Hunger Plan, developed by Herbert Back and other economic planners, calculated that the invasion force of 3 million men could be fed entirely from Soviet agricultural production if the Wehrmacht systematically confiscated food from occupied territories. This would necessarily mean starvation for Soviet civilians, but Nazi planners explicitly accepted this consequence as necessary and even desirable, fitting with their ideological goal of reducing the Soviet population to make room for German colonization. The economic planning documents for Barbarossa are chilling in their cold calculation. Planners estimated the caloric requirements of Wehrmacht soldiers, calculated the food production of different Soviet regions, and determined how much could be extracted while still maintaining minimal labor capacity in the Soviet population. They identified industrial facilities to be captured or destroyed, mapped raw material deposits for exploitation, and planned the reorganization of Soviet economic infrastructure to serve German needs. The invasion was conceived as an economic operation as much as a military campaign. But the practical implementation fell far short of these plans. The rapid Soviet evacuation of industry eastward, moving entire factories beyond German reach, denied Germany much of the industrial capacity they had hoped to capture. Soviet scorched earth policies destroyed resources before German forces could seize them. The vast distances and poor transportation infrastructure made systematic extraction of resources far more difficult than planners had anticipated. And Soviet resistance, both military and partisan, disrupted German economic exploitation throughout occupied territories. By 1943, economic reports to Hitler acknowledged that the Soviet campaign was consuming more resources than it provided, making it a net drain on German economic capacity rather than the profitable conquest originally envisioned. The economic dimension of the Holocaust deserves examination as part of understanding how Hitler funded his military, though this requires careful navigation to avoid reducing genocide to an economic calculation. The systematic murder of European Jews was fundamentally an ideological project driven by Nazi racial theories and Hitler's personal hatred, but it also had significant economic dimensions that Nazi planners explicitly incorporated into their policies. Before mass murder began, the economic exploitation of Jewish communities followed patterns of confiscation and forced labor. Successful Jewish businesses were taken through Aryanization. Jewish property was confiscated through special taxes and forced sales. Jewish workers were conscripted for forced labor at wages below subsistence levels or with no compensation at all. As Nazi policy shifted from persecution to systematic murder, economic exploitation intensified. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed Wehrmacht forces into the Soviet Union, murdering Jews and other targeted groups, routinely looted their victims before execution. Clothing, valuables, and any useful items were confiscated and sent back to Germany for distribution or sale. When systematic deportation to death camps began, the process was organized with economic efficiency in mind. Jews being deported were allowed to bring luggage with them, encouraging them to pack valuables that could then be confiscated upon arrival. At camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, arriving deportees underwent selection, with belongings confiscated from both those sent immediately to gas chambers and those temporarily spared for labor. These belongings were sorted in warehouses called Canada, because Canada was associated with wealth and abundance, by prisoners assigned to this task. Usable clothing was distributed to ethnic Germans or sold. Valuable items were catalogued and sent to German economic offices. Currency and securities were deposited in accounts. Even items of minimal individual value were collected and processed on industrial scales. Hair shaved from corpses was collected and sold to German textile companies for use in fabrics. Gold teeth were extracted and melted down, with the gold sold to finance SS operations. The scale of this plunder was enormous. At Auschwitz alone, warehouses found after liberation contained over 800,000 women's outfits, over 300,000 men's suits, and tens of thousands of children's clothing items. This was only what remained at the end, a fraction of what had been processed and distributed over the camp's operation. The total value of property confiscated from murdered Jews across Europe has been estimated at 8 to 10 billion Reichsmarks, though precise calculation is impossible given the scope of theft and the deliberate destruction of records. This represents a massive transfer of wealth that helped finance Nazi operations while serving ideological goals of destruction. The mobilization of women in the German war economy came later and less completely than in Allied nations, reflecting Nazi ideological commitments to traditional gender roles that conflicted with practical economic needs. Nazi ideology emphasized women's role as mothers and homemakers, and Hitler personally resisted mobilizing women for industrial work throughout most of the war. This ideological resistance created economic inefficiencies and labour shortages that forced greater reliance on forced labour from occupied territories and concentration camps. While Britain mobilized women extensively for war work from early in the conflict, and the Soviet Union employed millions of women in heavy industry and even combat roles, Germany maintained restrictions on female employment until late in the war. As late as 1943, with Germany facing critical labour shortages, millions of German women remained outside the industrial workforce. The shortage was filled instead through foreign forced labour and concentration camp workers, a choice that reflected ideological priorities even when it created economic inefficiencies. When German women were finally mobilised more extensively in 1943 and 1944, they entered a Yima workforce already structured around exploitation. German women workers received preferential treatment compared to foreign workers, with better rations, working conditions, and wages. But they worked alongside forced labourers and saw firsthand the conditions those workers endured. This created uncomfortable situations where ordinary German women became complicit in the exploitation system, supervising foreign workers, benefiting from their labour, and participating in an economic structure built on slavery. The delayed and incomplete mobilization of German women revealed the contradictions in Nazi economic policy. The regime needed maximum labor mobilization to sustain total war production, but ideological commitments prevented full use of the available German workforce, forcing greater reliance on coerced foreign labor and creating a system dependent on conquest to provide workers. This was yet another way Nazi ideology and economic rationality conflicted, with ideology ultimately taking precedence even when it created economic problems. Examining the specific fate of gold and valuables confiscated from Jews reveals the pathways through which theft was converted into usable financial resources. The process was systematically organized to maximize extraction while maintaining plausible deniability. When Jews were deported to death camps, they were often told they were being resettled for labor and encouraged to bring valuables with them. Upon arrival, these valuables were confiscated. Items of clear value, jewelry, gold, currency, were sent to SS economic offices. Items of potential value, quality clothing, watches, household goods, were sorted and either distributed to ethnic German settlers in occupied territories or sold within Germany. The sorting process was conducted with systematic efficiency. At the largest death camps, prisoner work details were assigned to sort confiscated property, organizing it by type and quality. Valuables were packed in cases and shipped to Berlin under armed guard. The SS Economic and Administrative Main Office received these shipments, catalogued them, and processed them for conversion to usable resources. Gold jewelry and dental gold was melted into standardized bars and deposited with the Reichsbank, providing the German state with hard currency reserves. Precious stones were sold through intermediaries in neutral countries, converted to foreign exchange. Currency from multiple countries was sorted and either used directly for purchases in those countries or exchanged through official and black market channels. The efficiency of this theft and conversion system generated enormous sums. Historians estimate that gold extracted from Holocaust victims and deposited in the Reichsbank amounted to several tons, worth tens of millions of Reichsmarks. Additional millions came from currency, jewelry sold through intermediaries, and other valuables. This wealth supplemented Germany's foreign exchange reserves at a time when normal trade had provided insufficient hard currency, enabling purchases of strategic materials from neutral countries. The system also generated personal enrichment for SS officers and others involved in the theft. At every stage, from initial confiscation through final processing, opportunities existed for individuals to pocket items or skim value. Some SS officers amassed personal fortunes through theft from victims, taking particularly valuable jewelry or currency for themselves rather than depositing it in official channels. Some of this privately stolen wealth was never recovered, disappearing into personal accounts or hidden caches that enriched perpetrators and their heirs long after the war. The financial mechanics of how individual Nazi leaders enriched themselves through economic exploitation reveals the corruption that permeated the entire system from top to bottom. Hermann Goring, as head of the 4-year plan and one of Hitler's closest associates, amassed a personal fortune that rivaled that of Europe's wealthiest aristocrats. Beyond his official salary and benefits, Goring enriched himself through systematic corruption. He took bribes from industrialists seeking favourable treatment in contract awards and resource allocations. He appropriated property confiscated from Jews, claiming artworks, jewellery and real estate for his personal collection. His Karinhall estate outside Berlin became a repository for stolen art worth hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks, acquired through forced sales, outright theft and abuse of his official position. Goring's art collecting was particularly systematic. He employed art experts to identify valuable pieces in occupied territories, then used his authority to seize them for his personal collection. When Jewish-owned art collections were confiscated, Goring had first choice before items were allocated to museums or other Nazi leaders. He traded his official influence for art treasures, arranging favourable treatment for French collaborators in exchange for access to their art collections. By war's end, Goring's collection included works by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Rubens, and hundreds of other masters, making it one of Europe's most valuable private art collections, nearly all acquired through theft and coercion. But Goring was hardly alone in using official position for personal enrichment. Many Nazi Gauleiters, regional party leaders, built personal fortunes through corruption. They awarded contracts to companies that paid them bribes. They confiscated property and kept it for themselves, or sold it for personal profit. They skimmed resources intended for official purposes, enriching themselves while subordinates went without supplies. The decentralized nature of Nazi administration and Hitler's tolerance for corruption among loyal subordinates created an environment where official position was routinely abused for personal gain, the role of banks. Beyond Dresdner Bank in facilitating economic crimes deserves examination. Deutsche Bank, Germany's largest financial institution, participated extensively in Aryanization of Jewish businesses, provided financing for companies employing slave labour, and managed accounts holding proceeds from confiscated property. Bank executives sat on corporate boards of companies utilising forced labour and approved loans for expansion of facilities that would employ concentration camp workers. Like Dresdner Bank, Deutsche Bank employees knew or should have known that the transactions they processed involved criminal activity. Yet the bank continued normal business operations, taking its fees and maintaining professional relationships with criminal enterprises. Commerzbank, another major German bank, similarly profited from Nazi economic policies. The bank financed industrial expansion in occupied territories, managed currency exchanges that involved looted assets, and provided banking services for SS economic operations. After the war, investigations revealed extensive documentation of the bank's involvement in transactions clearly connected to confiscated property and forced labour programs. The post-war reckoning for these banks proved limited. Some executives faced trial, received short sentences or fines, and generally returned to positions in post-war banking. The institutions themselves survived, eventually thriving in post-war West Germany. Compensation to victims of bank complicity in Nazi crimes came decades later and in amounts that barely acknowledged the scale of institutional responsibility. Modern banks carrying these names have acknowledged historical responsibility and contributed to compensation funds, but questions remain about whether these acknowledgements adequately address institutional complicity in financing crimes against humanity. The evacuation and plunder of museums and cultural institutions across occupied Europe represented organized theft on a scale unprecedented in history. Nazi art confiscation operated through multiple organizations with overlapping and sometimes competing mandates. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, named after Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, was established specifically to confiscate art and cultural materials from Jews and other enemies of the Reich. The ERR operated across occupied territories, identifying valuable collections, cataloguing them, and shipping materials to Germany. In France alone, the ERR confiscated over 100,000 artworks, furniture pieces, and cultural objects from Jewish-owned collections, shipping them to Germany in specially organized transport trains. Some items went to German museums. Some were designated for a planned Führer museum that Hitler intended to build in Linz, Austria, and substantial portions were distributed to Nazi leaders for their private collections, with Goring receiving particularly favourable treatment. Beyond the ERR, the Wehrmacht also confiscated art ostensibly to protect it from damage during military operations, but in practice treating occupied territories as sources of plunder. Individual military commanders appropriated artworks for personal collections. Units sent particularly valuable pieces to Germany as gifts for high-ranking officers or for deposit in German museums. The distinction between protection and theft was often nominal. Items taken for safekeeping rarely returned to original owners, instead becoming permanent additions to German collections. In the Soviet Union, systematic cultural plunder operated on even larger scales. Entire museum collections were confiscated, with artworks, historical artifacts, and cultural treasures shipped to Germany by the trainload. Libraries were emptied, with rare books and manuscripts transported west. Religious items, icons, ceremonial objects were taken from churches and synagogues. Nazi racial ideology classified much Slavic culture as inferior, so some confiscated items were simply destroyed rather than preserved, but items deemed valuable enough to warrant theft were taken on massive scales. The recovery of this stolen cultural property after the war proved enormously complex. Some items were found in salt mines and other storage facilities where they had been hidden in the war's final months. Allied monuments men worked diligently to identify and return artworks to rightful owners or countries of origin, but many items remain missing, sold through neutral countries to collectors, held in private collections of Nazi officials who escaped prosecution, or taken by Soviet forces as war reparations and never returned. Even today, art confiscated during the Nazi period occasionally surfaces in museums or private collections, triggering legal battles over ownership and restitution. The economics of collaboration in occupied territories created morally complex situations where local populations participated in exploitation of their own countries. In every occupied territory, some local individuals and businesses profited from collaboration with German economic policies. In France, businessmen purchased Jewish-owned firms at fire sale prices during Aryanization, enriching themselves through participation in persecution. In Poland, some ethnic Poles benefited from confiscation of Jewish property, moving into homes and taking over businesses left vacant by deportation and murder. In the Soviet Union, some individuals cooperated with German occupation authorities, serving in auxiliary police units, working as administrators in occupation governments, or facilitating German economic exploitation in exchange for preferential treatment. The motivations varied. Some collaborated from ideological sympathy with Nazi goals, sharing anti-Semitism or supporting German promises of anti-communism. Some collaborated from opportunism, seeing chances for personal gain through cooperation with occupiers. Some collaborated from desperation, accepting cooperation as necessary for survival under brutal occupation, and some collaborated under coercion, threatened with death or reprisal if they refused German demands. But regardless of motivation, collaboration created local beneficiaries of Nazi economic exploitation who had personal interests in maintaining occupation systems. After liberation, many occupied countries faced difficult reckonings with collaborators. France conducted extensive purge trials, prosecuting thousands of individuals for economic collaboration, including businessmen who had profited from Aryanization and black market operations with German forces. Some received harsh sentences, including execution for serious collaboration. Others received lighter punishment or escaped prosecution entirely. The process was often complicated by the reality that strict enforcement would have implicated large portions of the population, since nearly everyone in occupied territories had engaged in some level of necessary cooperation with occupation authorities for simple survival. Distinguishing between collaboration that crossed moral lines and accommodation necessary for survival proved practically and legally difficult. Similar processes occurred across Europe with varying outcomes. In the Netherlands, Norway and Belgium, collaborators faced trials and punishment, though enforcement varied in stringency. In Eastern European countries that came under Soviet control, some collaborators faced harsh Soviet justice, while others who cooperated with Soviet authorities were protected. The economic dimensions of collaboration, who profited from occupation policies, and how thoroughly they were held accountable, remain contentious topics in many countries' historical memories of the occupation period. The role of occupied territories' resources in sustaining specific aspects of German military operations provides concrete examples of how conquest was essential to continued warfare. Romanian oil from Ploiești fields provided Germany with substantial petroleum supplies from 1941 until Soviet forces captured the region in 1944. Without Romanian oil, Germany's fuel situation would have become critical years earlier than it actually did. German synthetic fuel production, despite massive investment, never provided sufficient supplies for military needs. Romanian petroleum made up the difference, keeping Wehrmacht vehicles, Luftwaffe aircraft and Kriegsmarine ships operational. When Romania switched sides in August 1944 and Soviet forces secured Ploiești, German fuel shortages became immediately catastrophic, contributing significantly to military collapse in the war's final months. French industrial production similarly sustained German military operations. The forced production of trucks, railway equipment, aircraft components, and other military materials in French factories supplemented German production. Exact figures are difficult to establish since much production was classified and records incomplete, but historians estimate that French industrial production for German military use amounted to at least 20% of total German war production by 1943. This was not marginal contribution, but essential support without which German forces would have faced critical equipment shortages earlier in the war. Belgian coal, Dutch industrial diamonds, Norwegian aluminum, Yugoslavian copper, Greek chrome, each occupied territory contributed specific resources that filled gaps in German supply. The loss of each territory as Allied and Soviet forces advanced created cumulative effects that strangled German war production. By early 1945, Germany had lost most occupied territories and with them the resource base that had sustained military operations. Production collapsed not just from Allied bombing but from loss of raw materials and industrial capacity in formerly occupied regions. This illustrates how fundamentally dependent German military power had become on conquest and exploitation. Without occupied territories to plunder, the Wehrmacht could not be sustained. The Nazi war economy was built on an assumption of perpetual expansion, and once expansion reversed into contraction, economic collapse became inevitable. The post-war careers of many individuals who enriched themselves through Nazi economic policies raised troubling questions about justice and accountability. While a few high-profile figures faced trial and punishment, many escaped serious consequences. Industrial executives who employed slave labor and profited from confiscated property often returned to business after brief interruptions. In some cases, they used wealth accumulated during the Nazi period to rebuild business empires in post-war West Germany. The Flick family provides a representative example. Friedrich Flick built a major steel and industrial conglomerate during the Nazi period, employing thousands of slave laborers and profiting from Aryanization of Jewish businesses. Convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 7 years, Flick was released after serving just 3 years. He rebuilt his industrial empire, becoming one of West Germany's wealthiest men. When he died in 1972, his estate was worth billions of Deutschmarks, much of it traceable to foundations laid during the Nazi period through criminal exploitation. The Flick case was not exceptional, but typical. Many industrialists and business leaders who collaborated with Nazi crimes and profited from exploitation faced minimal consequences and returned to prosperity after the war. Their success raised fundamental questions about whether justice had been adequately served and whether economic crimes received appropriate punishment. The Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria in March 1938, provided the first major test of Nazi economic exploitation on a national scale. Austria was not a wealthy country by Western European standards, but it possessed resources that Germany desperately needed. Most importantly, Austria's central bank held gold reserves worth approximately 748 million Reichsmarks, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly half of Germany's entire annual military budget at that time. Within hours of German troops crossing the border, SS units secured Austria's central bank and began the systematic transfer of these gold reserves to Berlin. The operation was executed with military precision, reflecting careful planning that predated the actual invasion. But the gold was only the beginning. Austria possessed modern armaments factories, particularly in Speyer and Vienna, that could be immediately integrated into German weapons production. The country had trained soldiers who could be inducted into the Wehrmacht, adding roughly 150,000 men to German military strength. and Austria's annexation extended German borders, providing direct access to Hungary and Yugoslavia and improving Germany's strategic position for future expansion. The economic plunder of Austria followed a systematic pattern that would be refined and repeated with each subsequent conquest. First came the seizure of monetary assets, gold, foreign currency reserves, and securities held by Austrian banks and the government. Next came the appropriation of Jewish-owned property, which proceeded even more rapidly than in Germany proper. Austrian Jews, numbering about 200,000, were immediately subjected to the same discriminatory laws that had evolved gradually in Germany over 5 years. Within months, thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, apartments, and valuables had been confiscated. The speed and thoroughness of Austrian Jewish persecution shocked even some Nazi officials, but it proved economically lucrative, transferring hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks worth of property to the German state and Austrian Nazis. Industrial integration followed. Austrian factories were immediately repurposed for German military production. The famous Steyr-Daimler-Puch works, which had produced civilian automobiles and machinery, began turning out military vehicles and weapons. Mining operations in Austrian Alps began supplying Germany with iron ore and other minerals. Even Austria's forests became resources for German exploitation, providing lumber for construction and wood for the synthetic fuel industry. By the end of 1938, German economic planners estimated that the annexation of Austria had provided Germany with resources equivalent to at least 2 years of normal economic growth. The gold reserves alone had restored German financial flexibility at a crucial moment when Mefo bills were coming due, and Schacht's warnings about unsustainable debt were becoming harder to ignore. Austria's example demonstrated that conquest could be profitable, that aggressive expansion could solve economic problems that normal fiscal policy could not address. This lesson would shape Nazi strategy for the remainder of the pre-war period and ultimately contribute to the decision to launch World War II itself. Czechoslovakia presented an even more attractive target. Unlike Austria, which had been economically depressed since the collapse of the Habsburg Empire in 1918, Czechoslovakia was an industrial powerhouse. The country possessed the Škoda Works, one of Europe's premier armaments manufacturers, capable of producing artillery, tanks, and small arms of excellent quality. Czechoslovakia's border regions, the Sudetenland, contained significant German populations and also housed important industrial facilities. And most temptingly for Nazi planners, Czechoslovakia held gold reserves worth approximately 1.3 billion Reichsmarks, even larger than Austria's confiscated treasure. Hitler's strategy toward Czechoslovakia unfolded in stages, each designed to maximize German economic gains while minimizing international opposition. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 gave Germany control of the Sudetenland, bringing with it industrial facilities and the strategic advantage of penetrating Czechoslovakia's border defences. But Hitler had no intention of stopping with the Sudetenland. In March 1939, in violation of the Munich Agreement, German forces occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under direct German control. The economic exploitation began immediately and proceeded with greater sophistication than in Austria. The Czechoslovak gold reserves became the target of one of the more audacious financial crimes of the era. Much of Czechoslovakia's gold was held not in Prague but in the vaults of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and in the Bank of England in London. Through a combination of legal manoeuvring, threats, and exploitation of international banking protocols, the Germans succeeded in gaining control of much of this gold. The Bank of England, controversially following formal legal procedures despite the obvious injustice, transferred Czechoslovak gold to German accounts, providing Hitler with hundreds of millions in convertible assets just months before the outbreak of war. The Škoda Works became a prize of incalculable value. Under German control, Škoda's production was redirected entirely toward military equipment. The company's excellent 37mm anti-tank gun became a standard Wehrmacht weapon. Its light tanks, already in service with the Czechoslovak army, were superior to many early German models and were immediately pressed into German service. Throughout World War II, Škoda would produce thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition for the German war effort, making it one of the most important armaments producers under German control. Beyond Škoda, Czechoslovakia offered a complete industrial infrastructure. The country possessed excellent steel mills, chemical plants, machinery manufacturers, and a skilled workforce. Unlike Austria, which had needed significant investment to upgrade its industries, Czechoslovakia's factories could be immediately exploited at full capacity. German economic planners estimated that occupying Czechoslovakia increased German industrial capacity by approximately 20%, a staggering gain achieved through conquest rather than investment. The pattern was becoming clear and ominous. Each conquest enriched Germany far beyond what normal economic development could achieve. Each annexation brought gold, foreign exchange, industrial capacity, and resources that temporarily solved Germany's chronic economic problems. But each conquest also raised the stakes, creating expectations of further expansion and making retreat politically and economically impossible. By mid-1939, Germany's economy had become addicted to expansion. The debts created by rearmament could only be serviced through plunder. The military machine being built could only be sustained through conquest. The question was no longer whether Germany would go to war, but when and against whom. Hitler had already scheduled his next target: Poland. And unlike Austria and Czechoslovakia, Poland had alliance treaties with Britain and France, powers that had declared they would fight rather than accept further German expansion. Germany's economic house of cards was about to require a much larger foundation, one that could only be built through total war and unlimited exploitation. The role of Germany's major industrial corporations in rearmament and the exploitation that funded it represents one of the most morally complex aspects of Nazi economic history. Companies like Krupp, IG Farben, Thyssen, Siemens, and dozens of others were not passive victims of Nazi policy. They were active, often enthusiastic participants who profited enormously from rearmament, conquest, and later, slave labour. Friedrich Krupp AG, the steel and armaments dynasty that had equipped German military forces for generations, embraced the Nazi regime with particular enthusiasm. Alfred Krupp, who took control of the company in 1943, and his father Gustav Krupp before him, saw Hitler's rearmament program as a godsend after years of restricted production under Versailles Treaty limitations. The company's massive Essen works ramped up production of artillery, armour plate, and specialised steel, growing from about 35,000 employees in 1933 to over 100,000 by 1939. Krupp's profits soared as military contracts flowed in, and the company showed no hesitation in accepting those contracts regardless of how they were funded or what they would be used for. IG Farben, the chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate, became perhaps the most infamous corporate collaborator with Nazi criminality. The company had been formed in 1925 through the merger of several major German chemical firms, creating a behemoth that dominated European chemical production. IG Farben's expertise in synthetic materials made it essential to Nazi autarky plans. The company developed and produced synthetic rubber, synthetic fuel, and a vast range of chemical products necessary for modern warfare. But IG Farben's collaboration went far beyond simply fulfilling government contracts. The company's executives sat on Nazi economic planning boards, helped design policies for chemical industry development, and enthusiastically embraced the opportunities presented by conquest. When Germany occupied Poland and other territories, IG Farben moved quickly to seize chemical plants and industrial facilities, incorporating them into the company's empire. Most notoriously, IG Farben built a massive synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz, deliberately locating the facility next to the concentration camp to ensure access to slave labour. The Buna works at Auschwitz became a symbol of corporate complicity in Nazi crimes. The plant employed tens of thousands of concentration camp inmates under conditions of deliberate brutality. Workers were literally worked to death, their productivity measured not in output but in how long they survived before being replaced. IG Farben paid the SS a daily fee for each worker, essentially renting human beings as disposable machinery. The company's managers knew exactly what was happening. They knew the workers were starving, being beaten, and dying, and they continued the operation because it was profitable. The question of how much these corporations knew about Nazi criminality and how willingly they participated has been debated extensively. The evidence suggests that corporate leaders were not naive or coerced. They knew that Jewish property was being confiscated and participated in purchasing those assets at fire sale prices. They knew that foreign workers and concentration camp inmates were being used as slave labour, and they requested more workers, specifying that they preferred those who could be worked hardest with least care. They knew that the materials they produced were destined for aggressive warfare, and they accelerated production to meet military demand. The profits were extraordinary. Between 1933 and 1939, corporate profits in heavy industry and armaments sectors increased by factors of 3, 4, even 5 times their pre-Nazi levels. Dividends paid to shareholders reached record highs. Executive compensations soared. The major industrial families of Germany, the Krupps, the Thysens, the Siemens clan, all saw their already substantial wealth multiply. This created a powerful constituency supporting Nazi policies, not because of ideological commitment to National Socialism, though some executives were true believers, but because rearmament and conquest were phenomenally profitable. The corporations also benefited from Nazi labour policies, beyond just slave labour. The regime's destruction of independent trade unions and prohibition of strikes gave management complete control over working conditions and wages. The reintroduction of military conscription removed millions of young men from the civilian labour market, reducing competition for jobs and allowing employers to hold down wages. The creation of compulsory labour service programs provided industry with workers at artificially low costs. All of these policies transferred wealth from workers to capital, from labour to ownership, creating conditions under which industrial expansion could proceed more profitably than would have been possible in a free market economy. But corporate collaboration also created vulnerabilities. The major industrial firms became dependent on government contracts, on access to resources controlled by Nazi economic planners, and on the continuation of policies that enabled their profits. When those policies required conquest and led to war, the corporations had little choice but to follow. They had built their expansion plans around assumptions of continued government support, continued access to forced labour, and continued conquest bringing new resources. When Germany began to lose the war, these corporations would face catastrophic consequences. Their profits had been built on foundations of sand, or more accurately, on foundations of stolen gold, confiscated property, and slave labour. When Allied forces arrived, there would be a reckoning, though many have argued that the punishment imposed was far less than the crimes warranted. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 transformed German economic exploitation from systematic but limited plunder of annexed territories to industrial-scale looting of entire continental regions. Poland, conquered in just over a month, became the first testing ground for occupation economic policies that would be applied with variations across Europe. The General Government, as the occupied Polish territories under German civilian administration were called, became a laboratory for extraction and exploitation. Polish industry was systematically dismantled and shipped to Germany. Factories were stripped of machinery, which was transported west and installed in German plants. Raw material stockpiles were seized. Railway equipment, trucks, and even agricultural equipment were confiscated for German use. The Bank of Poland's gold reserves, approximately 85 tons, disappeared into German vaults. But Poland also introduced a new and more horrific dimension to Nazi economic exploitation: the deliberate reduction of the Polish population to slave labour status. Hans Frank, the Nazi lawyer appointed to govern the general government, made the policy explicit in a December 1939 speech, where he declared that Poles would be used as workers for German purposes and that the territory would be ruthlessly exploited for German benefit. Polish industry that wasn't dismantled was converted to serve German needs. Factories that had produced consumer goods began producing military equipment or components for German industry. Polish workers were conscripted for forced labour, either working in Poland for starvation wages under brutal conditions or transported to Germany to work in factories, farms and construction projects. By 1944, over 1 million Polish workers had been deported to Germany as forced labourers, supplementing the German workforce that had been depleted by military conscription. Agricultural production was commandeered. Polish farms were forced to deliver quotas of grain, meat and other foodstuffs to German authorities at prices far below market value, essentially a form of tribute. The food extracted from Poland helped feed German civilians and military forces, while Polish civilians faced severe shortages and malnutrition. Nazi economic planners calculated that Poland should produce a food surplus that could be extracted to Germany, and they deliberately set policies to ensure Polish caloric intake remained at minimal subsistence levels to maximize the extractable surplus. The economic exploitation of Poland established patterns that would be repeated and intensified across occupied Europe. Each conquered territory would be stripped of monetary assets, industrial equipment, and raw materials. Local populations would be reduced to forced labor status. Agriculture would be reorganized to feed Germany rather than local populations. And Jewish populations would be systematically robbed before being murdered, their property flowing to German state coffers and individual Nazi officials. The invasion of Western Europe in May 1940 brought even greater prizes. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and above all France possessed industrial infrastructure, gold reserves, and resources that dwarfed what Germany had extracted from Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. France alone held gold reserves worth approximately 2,500 million Reichsmarks, though much of it had been evacuated to French colonies before German occupation. The gold that remained, combined with Belgian and Dutch reserves, provided Germany with another infusion of hard currency and financial flexibility. But the real value of Western occupation lay in industrial capacity and resource access. French steel production, concentrated in Lorraine and the north, was immediately integrated into German war production. Belgian coal mines provided fuel. Dutch industry supplied specialized products. Skilled French workers were conscripted for labor in Germany or forced to work in French factories producing for German military needs. The occupation authorities imposed a system of costs that transferred enormous wealth from occupied countries to Germany. France was forced to pay occupation costs of 400 million francs per day, later increased to 500 million francs daily. These payments, ostensibly to cover the costs of German occupation forces, far exceeded any reasonable estimate of actual occupation expenses. The excess flowed to Germany as tribute, helping to fund the German war economy. At the official exchange rate that Germany imposed, which grossly overvalued the Reichsmark against the franc, these payments represented billions of Reichsmarks in annual transfer of wealth from France to Germany. The same system was imposed on Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and later other occupied territories. Each country was forced to pay occupation costs that exceeded actual expenses, with the surplus representing outright theft. Over the course of the war, these occupation payments would transfer over 100 billion Reichsmarks from occupied Western Europe to Germany, representing one of the largest sustained thefts in economic history. Beyond occupation costs, the Germans implemented systems of compulsory delivery for industrial products and raw materials. French factories received orders for military equipment, machine tools, chemicals, and other products, with payment made in occupation francs that could only be spent on German goods, or used to pay occupation costs, creating a circular system that ensured wealth flowed toward Germany. Agricultural requisitions forced French farmers to deliver food to German authorities, again at artificially low prices, helping feed German forces and civilians, while French food consumption declined. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 represented the culmination of Nazi economic planning and the ultimate expression of exploitation-based warfare. Operation Barbarossa was conceived not just as military conquest but as economic plunder on an unprecedented scale. Hitler and his planners viewed the Soviet Union as a vast warehouse of resources, food, oil, minerals, and industrial capacity that could be seized to fuel German domination of Europe indefinitely. The economic planning for Operation Barbarossa, documented in the notorious Hunger Plan and related directives, explicitly called for the starvation of millions of Soviet civilians to extract maximum food supplies for German use. German economic planners calculated that the Wehrmacht could only be sustained in the Soviet Union if it lived off the land, requisitioning food from occupied Soviet territories. This would necessarily mean that Soviet civilians would starve, but this consequence was not just accepted, but intended. The deaths of 30 million Soviet civilians from starvation was projected as necessary to feed German forces and maintain food supplies to Germany. In practice, the implementation of these plans proved even more brutal than the already horrific documents suggested. German forces systematically stripped occupied Soviet territories of food, livestock, industrial equipment, and raw materials. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped to Germany or destroyed to prevent Soviet recapture. Agricultural machinery was confiscated, grain stores were seized, livestock was slaughtered for German consumption or driven west to German-controlled territory. The human cost was catastrophic, with millions dying from deliberate starvation policies. The economic returns, however, proved disappointing from the German perspective. The Soviet Union's scorched earth policy, combined with the vast distances involved and partisan resistance, limited German ability to extract resources as planned. Oil fields in the Caucasus, a primary objective, remained largely beyond German reach. Agricultural requisitions succeeded in causing mass starvation, but did not provide the sustained food surplus German planners had anticipated. Soviet industry evacuated east before German forces arrived, denying Germany the industrial capacity they had hoped to capture. By 1942, it was becoming clear that Operation Barbarossa had failed in its economic objectives. Rather than providing the resources to sustain unlimited German expansion, the Soviet campaign was draining German resources faster than they could be replenished through conquest. The Wehrmacht was experiencing unsustainable equipment losses. Fuel consumption exceeded available supplies. Casualties required replacement soldiers at rates that strained German mobilization capacity, and the hoped-for economic windfall from Soviet conquest was not materializing. This failure would have profound consequences for Nazi economic policy in the final years of the war, driving increasingly desperate measures to extract resources from occupied territories and exploit labor more ruthlessly. Albert Speer's appointment as Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, following Fritz Tott's death in an airplane crash, marked the beginning of total war economic mobilization in Germany. Speer, an architect by training and Hitler's personal favourite, brought to the position a combination of technocratic efficiency and complete moral blindness that would characterise the final phase of Nazi economic policy. Unlike Schacht, who had at least attempted to maintain some connection to economic rationality, or Goring, who combined incompetence with greed, Speer approached war production as a pure engineering problem where human costs were simply variables, to be optimized. Speer's first major achievement was to streamline armaments production through rationalization and standardization. German industry in the early war years had been remarkably inefficient, producing dozens of different tank models, aircraft variants, and weapon systems with limited parts compatibility. This created nightmares for maintenance, training, and logistics. Speer forced manufacturers to standardize designs, limit model variations, and focus on producing fewer types of weapons in larger quantities. The results were dramatic. German tank production increased from 5,200 units in 1941 to 19,800 in 1944. Aircraft production grew from approximately 11,000 planes in 1941 to over 40,000 in 1944. Artillery, small arms, and ammunition production all increased substantially. These gains were achieved not through new industrial capacity — Germany's industrial base was actually shrinking under Allied bombing — but through more efficient use of existing facilities, longer working hours, and most importantly, through massive expansion of forced labor. Speer's rationalization program depended fundamentally on slave labor. By 1944, forced laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and conscripted foreign workers constituted over 7 million people working in Germany, roughly 25% of the total workforce. These workers received minimal food, no safety protection, and no compensation beyond bare subsistence. They could be worked literally to death and replaced from the enormous pool of conquered populations and imprisoned people. The economic logic was brutally simple. Free German workers had to be paid wages, provided with housing, given rest periods, and treated with at least minimal consideration for safety and health. Slave laborers required none of this. They could be worked 12, 14, even 16 hours per day. They could be housed in barracks with no heating or plumbing. They could be fed starvation rations that slowly killed them. And when they died or became too weak to work, they could be replaced at no cost. From a purely economic perspective, ignoring all moral considerations, slave labor was far more efficient than free labor for producing low-skilled war materials. Speer understood this calculus perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. Fritz Sauckel became the central figure in recruiting and distributing forced labor. Appointed General Plenipotentiary for Labour Deployment in March 1942, Sauckel was tasked with providing German industry with whatever labour it needed by whatever means necessary. His approach was direct and brutal. Occupied territories received quotas for workers to be delivered to Germany. Local authorities, under threat of collective punishment, were ordered to round up workers and ship them to Germany in freight cars. Sauckel's recruiting methods barely qualified as recruiting. In practice, they were raids, roundups, and kidnappings. Young men and women would be seized in the streets, dragged from their homes, or arrested at checkpoints and transported to Germany as forced labourers. By war's end, Sauckel had overseen the conscription of approximately 5.5 million foreign workers from occupied territories, in addition to the millions of prisoners of war who were forced into labour in violation of Geneva Convention protections. The geographic scope of forced labour recruitment was vast. Workers came from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, and virtually every territory under German control. Soviet civilians constituted the largest single group, with over 2.8 million transported to Germany, but significant numbers came from every occupied country. These workers were distributed across German industry, from coal mines to factories, from farms to construction sites, creating a continent-wide system of slavery that rivaled in scope, if not in individual brutality, the plantation slavery of previous centuries. The conditions faced by forced labourers varied somewhat by national origin, reflecting Nazi racial hierarchies. Workers from Western Europe, particularly those considered Germanic like Dutch or Scandinavian workers, received somewhat better treatment, though still under coercive conditions. Polish workers faced harsh treatment but were at least recognised as humans capable of labour. Soviet workers, and especially Soviet POWs, occupied the bottom rung, subjected to deliberate starvation, brutal treatment, and casual murder. The mortality rate among Soviet forced labourers reached horrific levels, with hundreds of thousands dying from malnutrition, disease, and industrial accidents in just the first year of their captivity. But from the Nazi economic perspective, this differential treatment made sense. Germanic workers might potentially be Germanized and integrated into a Nazi-dominated Europe, so there was marginal value in keeping them alive and healthy. Slavic workers were viewed as disposable subhumans whose only value was their labour capacity, so working them to death was acceptable as long as replacements could be obtained. This racist economic logic pervaded every aspect of forced labour policy, determining rations, housing, medical care, and treatment. The concentration camp system, originally established for political repression, evolved into a major component of the Nazi war economy under SS administration. Heinrich Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, controlled the camps and saw them not just as tools of terror, but as potential sources of economic profit. The SS established numerous enterprises using concentration camp labour, from quarries and brickworks to weapons factories and chemical plants. The economic organisation of the concentration camp system was overseen by the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt, or SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, known by its German acronym WVHA. Under the leadership of Oswald Pohl, the WVHA managed a vast economic empire employing hundreds of thousands of prisoners in enterprises that generated substantial revenue for the SS. The business model was straightforward. Concentration camp inmates cost the SS virtually nothing. They were fed starvation rations costing a few Reichspfennigs per day. They received no wages. Housing consisted of overcrowded barracks built by prisoner labour. Medical care was non-existent for most prisoners. The only costs were for guards and minimal administrative overhead. Against these trivial costs, the WVHA could charge German companies substantial fees for prisoner labour or operate SS enterprises that sold products at market prices. The profit margins were extraordinary, limited only by how many prisoners could be kept working before dying. Major German corporations participated enthusiastically in this system. IG Farben's Buna works at Auschwitz has already been mentioned, but it was far from alone. Daimler-Benz used concentration camp labour to produce aircraft engines and military vehicles. BMW employed prisoners in its aircraft engine plants. Volkswagen's plant near Fallersleben, built specifically to produce military vehicles rather than the promised people's car, used thousands of concentration camp workers. Siemens operated factories adjacent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, employing female prisoners in electronics production. Even smaller companies participated, renting prisoners from the SS for construction projects, mining operations, or manufacturing. The financial arrangements varied but followed common patterns. In some cases, companies paid the SS a daily fee per prisoner, typically between 4 and 6 Reichsmarks, far less than the cost of free labor but generating substantial revenue when multiplied by thousands of prisoners. In other cases, SS enterprises sold products to private companies or to the German military at market prices, pocketing the difference between production costs with slave labor and market prices. The WVHA became one of the largest economic organizations in Germany, with annual revenues in the hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks, but the human cost was almost incomprehensible. At Auschwitz alone, IG Farben's Buna works and associated operations worked tens of thousands of prisoners to death. At Dora Mittelbau, where V-2 rockets were produced in underground factories using concentration camp labor, the death rate exceeded 30% annually, meaning that prisoner workers could expect to survive about 3 years before dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, or industrial accidents. At Mauthausen's stone quarries, prisoners were quite literally worked to death carrying heavy stones up steep stairs, often pushed to their deaths by guards when their pace slowed. The deliberate policy was Vernichtung durch Arbeit, destruction through work, a concept that made explicit the economic calculation that prisoners could be worked until they died, maximizing labor extracted while minimizing costs. The scale of wealth transferred from occupied territories to Germany through all these mechanisms is difficult to calculate with precision, but estimates provide staggering figures. Occupation costs alone transferred approximately 104 billion Reichsmarks from occupied Western Europe to Germany between 1940 and 1945. The value of industrial equipment, raw materials, and finished goods seized from occupied territories is estimated at 70 to 90 billion Reichsmarks. Agricultural requisitions transferred food worth approximately 28 billion Reichsmarks from occupied territories to Germany. Gold and foreign exchange seized from occupied national banks totaled approximately 6 billion Reichsmarks. The value of forced labor, calculated as the difference between what free labor would have cost and what was actually paid to forced workers, represented approximately 40 billion Reichsmarks. Add to these the confiscation of Jewish property across Europe, conservatively estimated at 8 to 10 billion Reichsmarks, and the total wealth transferred to Germany through conquest and exploitation reaches approximately 250 to 300 billion Reichsmarks. To put this in perspective, Germany's entire gross national product in 1939 had been approximately 130 billion Reichsmarks. Over 6 years of war, Germany extracted from conquered territories and enslaved populations wealth equivalent to roughly 2 years of total German economic output. This was not marginal support for the war effort. This was the foundation upon which German military operations rested. Without this massive transfer of wealth through conquest and exploitation, the German war economy would have collapsed by 1942 or 1943 at the latest. Yet even this enormous extraction proved insufficient to sustain total war against the combined industrial might of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By 1943, the contradictions in Nazi economic policy were becoming impossible to ignore. Allied bombing was destroying German industrial capacity faster than it could be rebuilt. The loss of North Africa and Italy cut Germany off from Mediterranean resources and trade routes. The defeat at Stalingrad and subsequent Soviet offensives meant that resources from occupied Soviet territories were being lost as the Wehrmacht retreated. Most fundamentally, the Reich was running out of men. By 1944, the Wehrmacht had suffered approximately 4 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Replacing these losses while maintaining industrial production required increasingly desperate measures. Germany's solution was to intensify forced labor exploitation even further and to conscript ever younger and older German men. 15-year-old boys and 60-year-old men found themselves in Wehrmacht uniforms. German women were finally mobilized for war work on a large scale, something Hitler had resisted earlier in the war for ideological reasons. Every possible source of labor was tapped, yet it was not enough. The arithmetic was inexorable. Germany and its occupied territories had a population of approximately 300 million people. The Allied coalition, including the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and its empire, numbered over 600 million. Germany's industrial capacity, even supplemented by plunder and forced labour, could not match the combined output of American, British and Soviet factories. German aircraft production peaked at about 40,000 units in 1944. The United States alone produced over 96,000 aircraft that same year. German tank production reached approximately 20,000 units in 1944. The Soviet Union produced over 29,000 tanks that year, while the United States added another 17,500. The numbers were even more lopsided in categories like trucks, where American production exceeded German output by factors of 10 or more. The Nazi economic system had achieved impressive results through brutal exploitation, but it was fundamentally outmatched by adversaries with larger populations, greater natural resources, and industrial capacity that didn't depend on slave labour. The role of the SS in economic exploitation deserves particular attention, because it reveals how Nazi racial ideology and economic opportunism reinforced each other. The SS began as Hitler's personal bodyguard and evolved into a state within a state, controlling the concentration camps, fielding its own military formations in the Waffen-SS, and operating vast economic enterprises. Heinrich Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, built his power base partially through economic resources independent of regular state budgets. SS economic enterprises included everything from mineral water bottling plants to publishing houses, from porcelain factories to experimental agricultural estates. Many of these businesses employed concentration camp labour, generating profits that flowed into SS coffers and funded Himmler's expanding empire, the Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke GmbH, or German Earth and Stoneworks, operated quarries at multiple concentration camps including Mauthausen, Flossenburg and Gross-Rosen. These quarries supplied granite, limestone and other building materials for Nazi construction projects, particularly the grandiose architectural schemes that Hitler and Speer planned for post-war Germany. The work was backbreaking and deadly. Prisoners worked in all weather, often with minimal clothing and inadequate tools, quarrying stone that was then hauled up steep paths or stairs. Guards deliberately made the work as brutal as possible, beating prisoners who moved too slowly, forcing them to carry loads beyond human capacity, and pushing them to their deaths in quarry pits. The mortality rate in SS quarries was among the highest in the concentration camp system, yet the operations generated substantial revenue that made them profitable from the SS perspective. The Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or German Equipment Works, operated workshops in concentration camps producing uniforms, boots and equipment for the SS and Wehrmacht. At Dachau, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz and other camps, prisoners worked in textile factories, shoe workshops and uniform manufacturing facilities. The products were sold to the German military at standard rates, while production costs were minimal since labour was free. Again, the combination of brutal treatment and no-cost labour generated profits that enriched the SS. But the SS economic empire rested on a foundation even more sinister than mere exploitation of camp labour. The systematic murder of European Jews generated enormous wealth through the confiscation of victims' property. Gold teeth extracted from corpses, jewellery and valuables confiscated upon arrival at death camps, currency and securities taken from deportees, all flowed into SS accounts. The action. Reinhard camps, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec existed primarily to murder Jews, but they also functioned as collection points for victims' property. The valuables collected were sorted, catalogued and shipped to SS economic offices, where they were converted into Reichsmarks or directly appropriated by SS officials. The amounts involved were substantial, though exact figures remain disputed. Gold teeth alone melted down and sent to the Reichsbank represented tons of gold. Jewellery, watches and other valuables confiscated from millions of victims constituted a massive transfer of wealth. The intersection of genocide and economic exploitation reached its most horrific expression in the concept of making death profitable. At Auschwitz-Birkenau and other combined labour and death camps, arriving prisoners underwent selection. Those deemed fit for work were temporarily spared, sent to labour camps where they would be worked until they collapsed. Those deemed unfit were immediately murdered in gas chambers. But even this murder was designed to be economically rational from the Nazi perspective. The gas used, Zyklon, B was a commercial pesticide whose cost was carefully calculated. The cremation of bodies was organized for maximum efficiency, with newer crematoria designed to handle more bodies using less fuel. Even the disposal of ashes was managed as an economic matter, with ashes sometimes used as fertilizer or fill material. Every aspect of the death camp system was analysed from a cost-benefit perspective, with the goal of murdering as many people as possible at the lowest cost per victim. This combination of genocide and economic calculation represented something qualitatively different from ordinary war crimes, or even from conventional slavery. It was the industrialization of murder, managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency and cost consciousness that a civilian corporation might apply to manufacturing widgets. The perpetrators were not frenzied killers acting in the heat of battle or passion. They were bureaucrats, engineers, and managers, implementing systematic policies designed to maximize profit while committing mass murder. The normalization of this horror within Nazi economic institutions remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire period. As 1944 progressed and Germany's military situation deteriorated, economic policy became increasingly desperate and contradictory. Speer pushed for maximum arms production, demanding more labour, more raw materials, and more industrial capacity, even as Allied bombing reduced Germany's industrial base and Soviet advances reclaimed occupied territories. Himmler expanded the concentration camp system, building new camps and subcamps to provide more slave labour, even as the supply of victims began to run out with the destruction of Jewish communities across Europe. Individual Nazi leaders pursued their own economic agendas, hoarding resources, competing for scarce materials, and building their personal empires even as the overall war effort suffered. The Nazi system, which had never been efficiently organized, descended into chaotic competition between different agencies and leaders. Goring's 4-year plan apparatus competed with Speer's armaments ministry for control of industrial resources. The SS economic empire operated semi-independently, often at cross purposes with civilian economic authorities. The Wehrmacht maintained its own procurement system, frequently clashing with civilian authorities over priorities. Regional Gauleiters, local Nazi party bosses with semi-independent power bases, pursued their own policies regardless of central directives. This organizational chaos was partially the result of Hitler's leadership style. He deliberately created overlapping authorities and competing power centers, believing that competition would produce better results and that it prevented any single subordinate from becoming powerful enough to challenge his authority. But by 1944, this system was producing paralysis and inefficiency at a time when Germany desperately needed coordinated economic management. Resources were wasted in bureaucratic competition. Critical bottlenecks emerged when competing authorities each assumed someone else was addressing a problem. Strategic priorities became impossible to establish when every leader pursued their own agenda. The economic system that had seemed to work through conquest and plunder was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and organizational chaos. The final year of the war saw the Nazi economic system consume itself in increasingly frantic attempts to sustain military operations against overwhelming Allied superiority. By January 1945, Germany had lost most of its conquered territories and with them the resources that had sustained the war economy. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which had provided much of Germany's petroleum, were in Soviet hands. The French factories that had produced military equipment were liberated. Polish coal mines, Belgian steel mills, and Dutch industries were no longer available for German exploitation. Even within the shrinking territory still under German control, Allied bombing had created catastrophic disruptions in transportation and production. Coal couldn't be shipped from Ruhr mines to power plants and factories because the rail system was destroyed. Components manufactured in one region couldn't be transported to assembly plants in another. Workers couldn't get to factories because their housing had been bombed. The sophisticated supply chains that modern arms production required were breaking down completely. Speer later estimated that German war production in the first quarter of 1945 had fallen to less than 20% of late 1944 levels. And even that remnant was based on drawing down inventories and cannibalizing existing equipment rather than new production. Yet the demands for more production only intensified. In the bunker in Berlin, Hitler continued to issue orders for new weapons programs, for increased production of jet aircraft for deployment of wonder weapons that would somehow reverse Germany's military fortunes, Speer, who had concluded by early 1945 that the war was irretrievably lost, nonetheless continued to organize production, driven by some combination of loyalty, habit, and inability to imagine any alternative. The industrial managers and corporate executives who had profited so handsomely from rearmament and conquest now faced catastrophe, but they had no choice except to continue following orders until the end. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces in 1945 revealed the full horror of the Nazi economic system to a shocked world. When American soldiers entered Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, they found thousands of emaciated prisoners amid factories and workshops where slave labour had produced military equipment. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, they discovered tens of thousands of dying prisoners and mass graves. At Dachau, liberated by American forces on April 29th, soldiers found subcamps surrounding the main facility, each one a workshop or factory employing prisoner labour for German companies. The liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet forces in January 1945 revealed the ultimate expression of Nazi economic brutality. The combination of mass murder with systematic exploitation, where even death had been reduced to an industrial process with calculated costs and efficiency metrics. The liberators found warehouses full of victims' property, hair that had been shaved from corpses for use in textiles, gold teeth waiting to be melted down, and thousands of barely living prisoners who had somehow survived the selection process and the brutal labour regime. The physical evidence of Nazi economic crimes was overwhelming. Corporate account books documented payments to the SS for prisoner labour. Shipping manifests showed the transfer of gold and valuables from death camps to Reichsbank vaults. Factory records proved that major German corporations had employed concentration camp workers. The paper trail of theft, exploitation and murder was extensive, detailed and incriminating. Allied authorities began gathering this evidence for what would become the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders would face justice for their crimes, including their economic crimes. But recovering the actual stolen wealth proved far more difficult. The gold reserves of occupied countries had been scattered. Some ended up in Swiss banks, where neutral Switzerland had accepted German deposits despite knowing they were stolen. Some had been converted to hard currency through transactions in neutral countries like Sweden, Portugal and Turkey. Some had simply disappeared into the personal accounts of Nazi officials who had systematically looted for their own benefit. Art treasures confiscated from Jewish families and museums had been distributed to German museums, sold to collectors, or taken by Nazi leaders for their private collections. Goring alone had amassed an art collection worth hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks through systematic theft. Industrial equipment seized from occupied territories had been integrated into German production or destroyed in the final months of war. Real estate confiscated from Jewish owners had been sold to new owners who claimed to be innocent purchasers. Unravelling these transactions and attempting to return stolen property to rightful owners would occupy Allied authorities and international organizations for decades after the war. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, included significant attention to Nazi economic crimes, though they were often overshadowed by the more dramatic charges of conspiracy to wage aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The International Military Tribunal heard extensive evidence about the looting of occupied territories, the exploitation of forced labour, and the systematic theft of Jewish property. Specific trials focused on economic crimes. The I.G. Farben trial, officially United States of America, versus Karl Krauch et al., began in August 1947 and resulted in convictions for 13 executives of the chemical conglomerate. The charges included slavery, mass murder through providing Zyklon B gas, and plundering occupied territories. The sentences were relatively light given the crimes, ranging from 18 months to 8 years, and most defendants were released early. This pattern of light sentences for economic criminals would be repeated in other trials. The Krupp trial convicted Alfred Krupp and 11 other company executives of plundering occupied territories and employing slave labour. Krupp received 12 years imprisonment and forfeiture of his property, but he was released after serving just 3 years and his property was restored. The leniency reflected both Cold War politics, as Western powers began to see German industrial capacity as necessary for containing Soviet influence, and the difficulty of establishing clear legal principles for corporate criminal responsibility. The prosecution had to prove that corporate executives knew about the criminal nature of their actions, that they had willingly participated rather than simply following government orders, and that their conduct violated established laws. Defense attorneys argued that the executives were businessmen trying to run their companies under difficult circumstances, that they had no choice but to accept government contracts and workers provided by authorities, and that they couldn't be held responsible for government policies. The argument was fundamentally dishonest, given the extensive evidence of corporate enthusiasm for Nazi policies and direct participation in criminal exploitation, but it proved effective in limiting sentences and enabling many economic criminals to escape serious punishment. Fritz Sauckel, the general plenipotentiary for labor deployment who had organized the forced labor program that enslaved millions, faced more serious consequences. Tried at the main Nuremberg trial, Sauckel was convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in the slave labor program and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on October 16, 1946. His trial revealed the systematic nature of forced labor recruitment, the appalling conditions workers endured, and the deliberate policy of treating human beings as disposable economic resources. Yet Sauckel's execution was almost anomalous among those responsible for Nazi economic crimes. Most survived, served short sentences, if any, and returned to positions of influence in post-war Germany. Albert Speer, despite his central role in organizing slave labor and war production, received only 20 years imprisonment at Nuremberg. He served his full sentence at Spandau prison and emerged in 1966 to become a best-selling author, presenting himself as the Nazi leader who had been misled rather than a willing architect of criminal exploitation. His memoirs Inside the Third Reich became an international bestseller, earning him substantial wealth and allowing him to rehabilitate his reputation as a technocrat who had simply focused on his job rather than confronting the moral implications of his actions. Speer's successful self-rehabilitation was emblematic of how many economic criminals escaped full accountability. The corporations that had employed slave labor and profited from Nazi crimes survived the war and in many cases thrived in post-war West Germany. IG Farben was broken up into constituent companies including BASF, Bayer and Höchst, but these successor companies became major international corporations. Krupp, Siemens, BMW, Daimler-Benz and other companies that had profited from forced labor continued as major industrial concerns. Some eventually paid modest compensation to slave laborers, but these settlements came decades after the war and represented tiny fractions of the profits earned through exploitation. The question of compensation for forced laborers became a protracted international issue that wasn't substantially addressed until the 1990s. During the Cold War, West Germany paid reparations to some victim groups but largely avoided acknowledging corporate responsibility for slave labor. East Germany declared itself free of Nazi responsibility since it claimed to have established an entirely new system. Most forced laborers received nothing, particularly those from Eastern Europe who found themselves behind the Iron Curtain and unable to pursue claims against Western companies. In the 1990s, renewed attention to Nazi economic crimes led to negotiations between victims' groups, corporations, and governments. In 2000, Germany established a foundation funded jointly by the German government and German companies to compensate forced laborers. The foundation paid approximately €4.4 billion to approximately 1.7 million survivors of forced labor. Individual payments averaged about €2,500 to €7,500, depending on the severity of conditions endured. These payments, while symbolically important, represented a tiny fraction of the economic value extracted from forced laborers. The delay also meant that many forced laborers died before receiving any compensation. By 2000, 55 years after the war's end, the majority of forced laborers had already died. The compensation went to survivors, leaving many victims uncompensated. Critics argued that the amounts were insulting given corporate profits from slave labor, and that the delay in compensation amounted to a strategy of waiting for victims to die before providing minimal restitution. Defenders argued that some compensation was better than none and that assigning financial liability for crimes committed over half a century earlier by previous corporate management was legally complex. The debate illustrated broader questions about historical justice, corporate responsibility, across generations and whether financial compensation could meaningfully address crimes of such magnitude. The recovery of looted art and cultural property became another long-term consequence of Nazi economic crimes. Major museums, private collectors, and families discovered in the post-war years that portions of their collections had been stolen by Nazis. The recovery process was complicated by multiple factors. Art had been scattered across Europe and beyond, making it difficult to locate. Many current holders had acquired pieces through seemingly legitimate transactions, complicating legal recovery efforts. Some art had been destroyed in the war's final months. Documentation of ownership was often incomplete, particularly for Jewish families whose records had been destroyed along with the families themselves. International law provided limited mechanisms for recovering cultural property across borders. Some pieces were found quickly and returned to rightful owners, or institutions. Soviet forces discovered portions of Goring's art collection and other Nazi-looted art, though much of what they found disappeared into Soviet museums rather than being returned to original owners. American and British forces established Monuments Men units specifically tasked with locating and protecting cultural property, and these units successfully recovered and returned thousands of items. But many pieces remain missing or in disputed ownership for decades. In the 1990s and 2000s, renewed attention to Nazi art theft led to new discoveries and returns. Museums began researching the provenance of their collections more thoroughly, discovering that some pieces had unclear ownership histories suggesting potential Nazi theft. Some museums voluntarily returned disputed pieces to heirs of original owners. Other cases required lengthy litigation. The issue remains unresolved even in the 2000s, with occasional discoveries of Nazi-looted art in private collections or museums sparking new legal battles over ownership and restitution. The economic history of Nazi Germany offers profound lessons about the relationship between economic systems and moral values. The Nazi economy achieved impressive results by conventional metrics. Unemployment was reduced from over 6 million to essentially zero by 1939. Industrial production increased substantially. Germany built a military machine that conquered most of Europe. These achievements led some observers, particularly in the 1930s before the full horror of Nazi policies became clear, to view Nazi economic management as successful, even admirable. But this assessment ignored the foundations upon which Nazi economic success rested. The reduction in unemployment was achieved partly through massive rearmament that was unsustainable without conquest, partly through forced labor programs that eliminated workers' freedom, and partly through exclusion of Jews and other targeted groups from economic activity. The industrial growth was financed through deficit spending disguised as commercial transactions, through confiscation of property from persecuted groups, and through systematic theft from occupied territories. The military machine was built and sustained through exploitation of forced labor, plunder of conquered nations, and economic policies that guaranteed eventual collapse. The Nazi economy was fundamentally a criminal enterprise, built on theft, sustained by slavery, and designed to function through continuous conquest and exploitation. It could only succeed as long as new territories could be conquered and new victims could be exploited. Once German expansion was halted and then reversed, the entire system collapsed with remarkable speed. This reveals an essential truth that the apparent economic success of the Nazi regime was illusory. It was not sustainable economic development, but a pyramid scheme that required constant expansion to avoid collapse. The moment expansion stopped, the contradictions became fatal. The corporate collaboration with Nazi crimes raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between business ethics and profit incentives. The major German corporations that employed slave labor, accepted stolen Jewish property, and profited from conquest were not explicitly ideological organizations. They were businesses pursuing profit within the legal and political framework that existed. When the Nazi government offered profitable contracts for armaments production, companies accepted them. When forced laborers were made available at minimal cost, companies employed them. When Jewish-owned businesses were offered for sale at fire sale prices, companies purchased them. From a narrow business perspective, these decisions made economic sense. They increased profits, reduced labor costs, and eliminated competition. But they also made corporations complicit in crimes against humanity. The executives who made these decisions knew, or should have, known that the workers provided by the SS were concentration camp inmates being worked to death. They knew that Jewish property was being confiscated through violence and persecution. They knew that armaments they produced would be used in wars of aggression. The knowledge was impossible to avoid, yet they proceeded because it was profitable and because refusing would have meant lost business and possibly personal consequences. This suggests a fundamental weakness in the proposition that corporations can be relied upon to behave ethically when ethics conflict with profit. Without strong external constraints, legal, regulatory, social, or moral, corporate behavior tends toward maximizing profit, regardless of broader consequences. The Nazi period demonstrated this principle with horrifying clarity. When the German state legitimized theft, slavery, and murder, German corporations adapted their business practices to profit from these crimes. The lesson is not that German corporations were uniquely evil, but that corporations in general, absent strong ethical constraints and legal accountability, will pursue profit even when doing so requires complicity in crimes. The Allied victory in 1945 brought the Nazi economic system to an abrupt end, but the consequences echoed for decades. The immediate post-war period saw desperate conditions across Europe as economies that had been distorted and stripped by Nazi exploitation struggled to recover. Germany itself faced catastrophic conditions. Major cities were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The transportation system was destroyed. Industrial capacity was substantially reduced or in need of extensive repair. Millions of displaced persons, former forced labourers, concentration camp survivors and refugees created humanitarian crises. Food production had collapsed, leading to near-starvation conditions in some regions. The division of Germany into occupation zones and later into separate East and West German states prevented coordinated economic recovery and created new distortions. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, provided crucial assistance for Western European recovery, including West Germany. American aid, totaling over $13 billion between 1948 and 1951, helped rebuild infrastructure, restore industrial capacity, and stabilize currencies. This aid was motivated partly by humanitarian concern, partly by political interest in preventing communist expansion, and partly by recognition that a prosperous Europe was necessary for global stability and American economic interest. The success of Marshall Plan aid in producing rapid recovery, the so-called German economic miracle of the 1950s, stood in stark contrast to Nazi economic policies. Where Nazi economics relied on theft and exploitation, Marshall Plan aid involved genuine investment. Where Nazi policies demanded continuous expansion to sustain an unsustainable system, Marshall aid supported sustainable economic development. The difference in results was dramatic. Within 15 years of the war's end, West Germany had not only recovered, but had become one of Europe's most prosperous nations, achieving this through democratic governance, market economics, and integration into international trade systems, rather than through conquest and slavery. The question remains how a supposedly advanced, educated, civilized nation embraced an economic system built on such fundamental criminality. Part of the answer lies in the specific historical circumstances of 1930s Germany. The trauma of World War I defeat, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, the catastrophe of hyperinflation in 1923, and the devastation of the Great Depression. These experiences created a population willing to accept radical solutions and to overlook moral concerns in pursuit of economic recovery and national restoration. Part of the answer lies in the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda, which portrayed Germany as a victim of international conspiracies, presented economic crimes as necessary measures for national survival, and dehumanized target populations to reduce moral resistance to their exploitation. Part of the answer lies in the human capacity for moral rationalization, where individuals focused on immediate personal benefits, employment, rising wages, business profits, while avoiding confronting the larger criminal system they were supporting. And part of the answer lies in the practical difficulties of resistance in a totalitarian system where opposition could mean imprisonment, death, or at minimum, social and economic exclusion. But these explanations, while historically important, cannot fully excuse the participation of millions of ordinary Germans in a system of systematic criminality. The soldiers who guarded slave laborers, the engineers who designed more efficient crematoria, the accountants who tracked stolen gold, the factory managers who worked prisoners to death, the bankers who accepted deposits of plundered wealth, all made choices. They could have chosen differently, even at personal cost. Some did choose resistance, though at terrible risk. The fact that most chose complicity suggests uncomfortable truths about human moral behavior under extreme conditions and about the fragility of ethical norms when confronted with authority, social pressure, and personal incentives for compliance. The economic history of Nazi Germany ultimately demonstrates that there are no shortcuts to sustainable prosperity, no clever financial schemes that can create real wealth without real production, and no economic system that can succeed indefinitely through theft and exploitation. The seemingly miraculous recovery of Germany under Nazi rule was built on foundations of sand. The Mefo bills that funded early rearmament were debt that would eventually need to be paid or repudiated. The Plunder of Austria and Czechoslovakia provided temporary windfalls but required continuous conquest to sustain. The bilateral trade agreements that provided raw materials without hard currency payment created debts that could only be settled through force. The forced labour that seemed to provide infinite manpower at minimal cost created a system of slavery that was both morally indefensible and economically unsustainable once the supply of victims was exhausted. Every aspect of the Nazi economic miracle was, on close examination, a confidence trick, a Ponzi scheme that required continuous expansion to avoid collapse. And like all Ponzi schemes, it eventually collapsed catastrophically, taking with it millions of lives and leaving devastation across a continent. The true lesson of Nazi economics is not about the effectiveness of central planning, or the power of government spending, or the potential of autarkic policies. The lesson is that economic systems built on criminality are fundamentally unsustainable, that apparent success achieved through theft and exploitation is illusory, and that there are moral limits that no economically rational calculation can justify crossing. Germany's experience showed that a nation could achieve dramatic short-term economic results through systematic criminality, but it also showed that such a system carries the seeds of its own destruction and inflicts immeasurable suffering in the process. Looking back at Hitler's economic policies from the perspective of the 2020s, we can see clearly what should have been obvious all along. You cannot build lasting prosperity on stolen gold, forced labour, and systematic murder. The billions of Reichsmarks transferred from conquered territories to Germany enriched the Nazi state and its supporters temporarily, but they contributed nothing to genuine development. The slave labourers who produced German armaments created short-term productive capacity, but at human costs that dwarf any possible economic benefit. The corporations that profited from collaboration with Nazi crimes gained wartime wealth but lost their moral foundation and eventually faced consequences, however inadequate, for their actions. The Nazi economic system was not an alternative model of development or a successful example of government-directed growth. It was a criminal enterprise, pure and simple, that achieved temporary results through methods that guaranteed ultimate failure and catastrophic consequences. Understanding this history remains crucial because the temptations it reveals remain present. The idea that a nation can restore prosperity through aggressive nationalism, that economic problems can be solved through scapegoating vulnerable minorities, that temporary benefits justify moral compromise. These seductive but false propositions continue to appear in various forms. The Nazi period shows where such thinking leads, and the lesson should never be forgotten. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into Nazi economic history both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Nazi Germany's industrial leaders after World War II, where we explore the post-war trials and fates of the corporate executives who collaborated with Hitler's regime. Understanding how Hitler funded his military expansion, despite Germany's economic constraints, reveals the fundamentally criminal nature of the Nazi system and the high costs of building power on theft, exploitation, and systematic brutality. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. Your support helps us continue producing detailed, well-researched historical content. See you in the next one!